Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is Andy, and today we're joined by Kyle of the Native Habitat Project. In this episode, Kyle opens up about his innovative approach to simplifying complex ecological topics and the vital role of private landowners in preserving local habitats. We dive deep into the heated debates within the conservation community, covering controversial practices like herbicide use, prescribed burns, and tree cutting, and hear Kyle's personal experiences with managing invasive species amidst criticism from the permaculture community. Kyle also sheds light on the critical efforts to revive Alabama's endangered prairie ecosystems, sharing poignant stories about the historical significance and current restoration projects aimed at preserving these precious habitats. Moreover, we discuss the crucial involvement of corporations in sustainable development and the emotional and ethical dilemmas faced by conservationists. Whether you're a seasoned conservationist or just starting your journey, Kyle's story and insights will leave you motivated to make a difference in your own community. So tune in and let us know what you think about this episode. And, of course, follow Kyle at Native Habitat Project on all your social media. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on. First off, I'm not on TikTok, really, so I will speak to your Instagram, but you got a great audience. People, you make really cool content. How did you end up getting into making content?
Oh man, that's a long story. It seemed like a million things just came together all at once to where finally I was like, all right, enough of it. Somebody's got to start talking about this stuff. And so I started making videos about native plants, but I was a private forester and, well, I guess we'll step back. I'm not going to go back to my childhood. I'll go back to my college days. I want to mention this to you. I went to Alabama A&M University. It's in Normal, Alabama, and y'all are always talking about one of y'all's podcasts. Y'all mentioned normal like a million times, and I was like,
oh, yeah,
the normal norm thing going on. But yeah, so I went to Alabama A&M for forestry, worked for State Fish and Wildlife. I was there for 3 years, and then I graduated in 2017. And just kind of worked I got married and just a bunch of life changes. And then I was traveling around Alabama as a private forester. And I guess it was about that time where I'd already had an interest, I guess, in some native ecosystems and native plants, just mostly out of frustration that I didn't learn about them in school. And as I was traveling around the state, North Alabama, Middle Tennessee, I was coming across all sorts of crazy stuff, crazy plants that I'd never seen before. And so each week I'd just take a bunch of photos and then I would just do a photo dump on Facebook of all these plants I was seeing that week. And when I saw them in person, half of them I probably didn't even know what they were. And I'd come home and try to figure out what species they were. And so then when I put them on Facebook, I just identify all the stuff and people started looking forward to that. People would get mad if I didn't do a photo dump 1 week of all these species I was seeing. So I think it was just a kind of people enjoyed I noticed that people enjoyed being able to connect to nature and what's around them and learn more about what's here in North Alabama through my social media posts. And so I was like, well, I think it may have been the winter of 2020. I remember just waiting on spring and telling myself, hey, when spring gets here, I'm going to start making videos about this stuff. And as soon as the Virginia bluebells and all the phlox and Solomon seal and trilliums and all this stuff just started blooming in one of the bottomland areas that I frequented. I went there and I just started making content about it. And I think it's maybe the third or fourth video. It just kind of took off. And so I kept at it and just was kind of religious about it, making posts, sometimes a couple posts a day, every other day. And I tried not to lose that momentum, and I think that was a lot of it is just keeping at it. So that's probably a lot of my social media success is just the fact that I haven't got burned out on it yet, and which is pretty tough to do. So
yeah, I mean, I tried doing something similar about like highlighting invasive species and kind of the opposite end of like, let's look around this, autumn olive and like what's going on in the understory, nothing. I'm trying to like highlight like, okay, these species are not interchangeable, right? There's much more to it. There's this downstream effect of these invasive species with ecological succession and so on. It's a lot of work to make video content.
It is.
I'm amazed at your capacity to pump out that stuff.
it is a lot of work, and I'm super ADHD, and I get distracted, and I have trouble following through with stuff because my attention will change over to something else. So people are often amazed at how fast, like I can I make and edit a video while I'm there on the spot in the field. Like it's done within 2 to 3 minutes, and it's something that's ready to post. I try to make it as simple and easy as possible for myself because I know if it's something I have to edit when I get home that day, the last thing I'm going to want to do is sit there on my phone and edit something. So I try to make it very simple because it is a lot of work, and I know if I make it too difficult, I won't do it at all. So it's I probably could make more like higher quality videos and stuff, but keeping it simple and just like being able to post quantity over quality, I guess, is kind of been my aim, and it seemed to work for me so far. So,
Yeah.
but y'all, I'll leave the quality stuff up to you guys. So.
I feel like the opposite. I feel like we have our Substack, and I'm like, this is terribly written, but the information is there. It's consolidated in one accessible place, and like I could spend a lot more time making it read better and be clearer. But to your point, and I think this might underscore a bit, like for me, part of it is ADHD, and part of it is also like what's more important, a small amount of high quality stuff, or like a large amount of stuff that has the important parts are high quality, but the
Hmm.
superfluous stuff is kind of like whatever. Like I want people to know about this stuff. I don't really care if it's like presented in the cleanest way.
Yeah, exactly. That's been my approach, and it seems to work. I mean, that's just getting it in front of people. That's the thing. It's like there's so much content to consume nowadays, and to even compete against all the other stuff people are making content about. That's, even the stuff that's not conservation related. You've got to put out a lot of stuff. It seems like so. It's up and down, comes in waves, but it seemed to work, and I enjoy it. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it does seem to work, and people are excited, which I'm sure also from your perspective has kind of changed, or I imagine at least has shifted your relationship with the content that you're creating as you see people kind of give you feedback on what you're doing. And I mean, I know as somebody who has this kind of public, and I use that word very like quote unquote public persona, that you get caught up very much in kind of the firing range of like debates about forest management, burns,
Hmm.
native invasive species, arguments. Even if you don't want to get involved with them, you're going to get sucked into it somehow. And I'm curious if that's shifted your kind of perspective on what you're doing and kind of your understanding of what these ecosystems should look like at all.
It hasn't changed my idea of what they should look like. I mean, it might change how I post some of this stuff, but a lot of it, a lot of it too is like the better videos I have are the ones where there's some arguments going on in the comments, and it's something that not everybody agrees with. Those usually get more traction because of that. But yeah, it's the fire, any of these topics, fire and herbicides and cutting trees, like they're all topics that people are very opinionated about and have their very strong opinion on how those things should be used on the landscape. And a lot of times it's really different from mine and what I've seen from being out in the field so much. I've had early on, I made a post. I mean, I'm sure y'all have bush honeysuckle up where you're at.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I've seen how it takes over a forest. Well, up at my mom's place, she's got, I don't know, 20, 30 acres in the middle of just thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of forest. And on one roadside going down a hill where people dump all their yard waste, I saw a big patch of bush honeysuckle coming up. And so I went in there and sprayed it, and I made a video about it. And man, just people jumping down my throat immediately. A lot of it was I didn't even know such a sensitive topic amongst the permaculture groups, but like, man, that was like the main people who were like jumping down my throat were even people who had way larger followings than I did in the world of permaculture. And it made me step back like, whoa, like, okay, am I right or am I wrong? Like, because I'm not afraid to admit, when I'm in the wrong, because I've made a lot of mistakes in, doing this work. And I came to the conclusion, this, spraying this 40 foot by 40 foot patch of bush honeysuckle, it would take me weeks and weeks to remove that by myself by hand, and it's still going to resprout if I don't use herbicide. Or I can take 10 minutes and spray it, and I've saved thousands and thousands of acres from having to be sprayed, 10 to 20 years from now. So like I removed the source population, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a responsible use of herbicide to prevent more herbicide from having to be used in the future. And so I don't know there. Yeah, that's just one example, I guess, of what you were talking about. But there's a million of those stories, involving fire and its use in the landscape and opening up tree canopy and things like that. People feel very strongly about that stuff. But
Yeah, especially in the permaculture community.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was not part of that community or had never had any involvement with it until that. And I was like, man, that's apparently you haven't seen some of these places that have just gotten taken over with bush honeysuckle because it's ridiculous.
Mm.
When you see some of these places in Alabama near Huntsville, these mountains that are just solid bush honeysuckle, it'll take the breath out of you. You're just like, where like, do I even try to remove it? Because it seems like you can't keep up with the rate at which it spreads. But I don't know that if it was on their property, I think they'd feel differently about herbicides, But
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's really this important question about like scale that I think gets missed, and particularly in the permaculture space of like, oh,
Hmm.
well, everything has its place. Like, I think a lot of the invasive component is really tied to this idea of like photosynthesis is a net good without thinking about the
Hmm.
complex relationships of those species with the landscape around them,
Yeah.
especially if it's something that produces something good, which bush honeysuckle doesn't necessarily. But like with autumn olive, you get fruit. Or
Yeah.
one that's becoming a bigger problem up here is hardy kiwi, which has always been kind of like the baby of like the permaculture movement. Are you familiar with hardy kiwi at all?
No, never even heard of it.
So it's a kiwi plant that is hardy, and it's very big in the permaculture space because it's like this fast growing aggressive vine. And for a while there were farmers in like Vermont and northern New York who had been pushing to try to make it like a viable crop. But like a
Hmm.
lot of invasive species, after 30, 40, 50 years, it's suddenly because of the genetic changes from not having pressures from competitors and so on, it is kind of taken over forests, and it does well in shady areas. So it's like
Oh yeah,
it's really doing a lot of damage.
it's got all the qualities of a good invasive.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
produces a ton of seed, and it's produced,
Yeah.
but because it produces fruit, it's like, well, what's a bad thing? What's so bad about a fruiting thing that produces tons of food? Food forest, yada
Yeah.
yada yada. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, yeah, but big asterisk on that.
Yeah. I get that argument when I talk about Bradford pears. They're like, why would you kill a pear tree? I'm like, and it's usually from people who've probably never seen a Bradford pear and the calorie pear and like the size of the fruit that they produce. But I can only imagine that's it, probably even stronger argument, a more common argument you hear with that one if it's actually producing a large quantity of edible fruits. But it's crazy I even hear that on Bradford pears because their fruit's so tiny. But
Mm. Never seen someone picking them, so
no, me either. No. Yeah, and nurseries around here have had to stop selling pears just in general because they were selling them and people were reporting back to them that the fruit of the trees they had been sold were tiny, and so they had been hybridizing with Bradford pears too. So
Jesus.
they just totally stopped selling pears at all just because they're scared of what they'll. I guess unless they're grafted, you really don't know what they're gonna end up being.
Mm. I guess this brings me to this question about like if we're thinking about like restoration, landscape
Hmm.
restoration, what do you think is a bigger priority for like a focus? So like I do a lot of like just very early succession wild plants because it's like a good easy way to aggressively restore landscapes before invasives can move in.
Hmm.
Do you think that we should be focusing more on like these common native species, or should we be giving a lot more priority to the rarities? And like kind of what does that look like to you?
So man, when you're restored, like say you're doing it on a mass scale, like we're doing some prairie restorations for some clients, and we're doing like 100 acres, and so that's probably going to end up being mostly common species because if it wasn't common species, it would be turf grass or invasives. And so just for the sake of like getting as much native grasslands on the ground as possible, we're it's going to be made up predominantly of the common stuff. But that doesn't mean later on we can't come in there and add in some of the rare stuff that's, and by rare I mean plants that are uncommon, but also plants that are localized or unique to that area where we're doing that restoration. And so in my own landscaping, I mostly have local ecotype, rare stuff that's unique to my area of Alabama. And so, like last week, we had this Rudbeckia palustris that's very uncommon in Alabama, and the largest patch of it in the state is behind my house on like five of my neighbors' properties, and it went over onto this development as well, where half of it was over there, but half of it's destroyed now. But that's one that I'm want, it's I think it's found in Tennessee and Kentucky and Arkansas and Missouri, but like it's a species that loves fens and wet ground, and it likes limestone soils. But even in my own town in Alabama, the diversity changes so quickly. Just in my county, we have the Cumberland Plateau and the Molten Valley and the Tennessee Valley and the Little Mountain region. And all these places have different soil types. Even within the Molten Valley, you may have some areas that are sandier and sandstone based soils and areas that are more limestone. But I get, people are like, hey, I have a property that I would love to plant some of that on. And I'm like, well, yes, it's rare. Yes, it's from our area, but it probably wouldn't do good on your property. It's really picky about where it wants to be. So you have to factor that in as well. And what, when you're looking at a site. And so, for example, Porter's goldenrod is found three places in the world. Two of those places are in my county. And back in 2020, before I was even making videos, Dwayne Estes with Southeastern Grassland Institute, he had seen some of my photos on Facebook, and he said, "Hey, I know you're looking for plants down your way. Will you go look for this Porter's goldenrod?" Because it was found back in 2003 there, and that was the first time it had been seen in 160 years. And then Dwayne found a population in Tennessee, and it took them a while to figure out that what they had was this Porter's goldenrod that hadn't been seen in 160 years. And by the time they found out, they came back to Alabama, and our population was destroyed because they widened the highway. And so he sent me the pin on where it was originally found, and it was like less than a mile from my house. And so I was like, well, I'm going to come up and see the one in Tennessee. So I went up there and saw the plants. And that afternoon, I came back, and I had all these places in my mind of like where it might be able to survive. And so I was driving around, and in this neighborhood on a lot that hadn't been developed yet, in between two big oak trees, was this Porter's goldenrod. I found it, and it was in full bloom, and it was like three times the size of the population in Tennessee. Population in Tennessee was in a pine plantation, so it was very shaded and stunted. But that's a very, very rare plant. And when I'm looking for sites to reintroduce it to, I'm looking at kind of, this is just my like hillbilly, redneck Alabama approach to science, I guess. But I'm just like, all right, well, if there's Mower's rosinweed, if there's this species of Coreopsis, the hairy spiderwort, and all this little blue stem, if these are the species that I see growing with it here, maybe I can drive around and look for those other species, and that might be a good spot to look for more Porter sites. And if it's not there, then I can reintroduce Porters to that spot, and that's probably a good indicator of what the plant community is that Porters likes to be with. And so when restoring rare species, that's been my approach with that one anyways, is when I come across other prairie remnants. And for example, one of them's in this guy's front yard, and that's a long story, but he mows yards for a living, and he has Mower's rosinweed, which is an S1 in Alabama. It only grows in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And then he's got a bunch of this Coreopsis that I haven't figured out what species it is yet. I've showed it to a bunch of botanists, and they don't know either. And it has sensitive briar and tons of mountain mints. And so I'm like, all right, well, this is very similar, exactly the same species composition that's at the Porter site a couple miles down the road. So I've grown Porters and introduced it to that site. And so I don't know, in your own landscaping, I think it could be up to you. If you just want a fast approach to restoration, go with the common species. But I find more satisfaction personally in like finding this uncommon stuff that's near my house, like that. I just briefly mentioned that coreopsis that I thought was lance leaf coreopsis. And I was like, well, instead of buying lance leaf online, I'll just go down the road here on this roadside and collect seeds and grow it in my landscaping. Well, now I have like a huge patch the size of like two pickup trucks of this coreopsis, and I don't even I've showed it to every botanist in the state, and nobody knows what it is. So like, I thought it was lance leaf. Turns out because I collected local eco type stuff from a struggling roadside remnant down the road, and I was like, hey, you're struggling here. Let me give you a place to grow on my property. It turns out I've saved a species that doesn't even we don't even know what it is yet. So
That's awesome.
I don't know. That's been my approach, and I think it's up to each person, what they want to do. But I prefer finding what's near me and struggling and giving it a place to grow. So
I'm curious, you've done a lot of research. I think, it might be partly because of the fact where you are that there's so much diversity. But do you have a lot of, I guess, hope or expectation or belief that like a lot of these species that we think of as like either extinct or very rare, extremely rare, that they are hidden around the landscape and we just we haven't put the manpower into finding them? Like, should we be doing that?
maybe you'd be amazed at places I find stuff. And yeah, in some cases, I think you're right. I think there's still a lot left out there to find. On the other hand, you get out there looking for stuff, and it's mind blowing at how much has been disturbed and is no longer intact. So, like Madison County was a huge prairie, which is the county north of me. It was a huge prairie, the biggest prairie in North Alabama, mostly wide open grassland. And that is now the worst place to go look for grassland remnants. Like it's all gone. Every single bit of it's gone. And so it was all turned to cotton field. And so, yeah, in some cases, I think there is some stuff hidden, but you get those areas that have been disturbed for so long. Huntsville's been being disturbed for 200 plus years. Morgan County, where I'm at, was disturbed then too, but it not at the same, I guess, the same way that Huntsville was. And so there's still places to find around Hartsville or around Morgan County because it's so rocky in places, and it was more of a savanna in a lot of where I'm at, and so it wasn't as easy to convert over to crop fields. And so yeah, it really depends on where you're at.
Mm.
But also Jake, who works with me, Jake Brown, he's from Randolph County down in the Piedmont, and so the Piedmont comes up y'all's way too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes it all the way up to you or not, but he was in the Piedmont of Alabama, and he grew up there. Well, his wife is from where I'm from, and when we started working together, he was like, man, we just don't have the diversity that you have here. Like this is just a special area. Like y'all have so many prairie remnants. Like we don't have that where I'm growing up, where I grew up. Well, I start showing him all these prairie remnants around here, and he gets an eye for it. He goes back home, and after he's, spent several months down there, going back and forth visiting his parents' place, he brings me down there, and he's finding way better stuff than I'm finding here in North Alabama. Like, and he thought, he lived there his whole life, and he was like, oh, we don't have that stuff in Randolph County and Cleveland counties. Now they're down there finding rare stuff that's like unnamed and like just wild species, county records, state records. And like he had that same mindset that maybe where I'm at here in Morgan County is just special and unique. No, it's everywhere. Everybody, it lives somewhere where there's rare, uncommon species that could use some conservation help. And in most cases, the state and other agencies aren't doing that. And so that's where you as a private landowner can really have an impact. And so man, it makes me so mad when I go onto some of these public lands and I'm talking to, the land managers there, and they're like, we just don't have the funding to do this. And I'm like, man, I'm looking at like 6 wild white indigo plants right here. I've only seen that one other place in North Alabama. It doesn't cost anything for you to collect seeds of that and propagate them, or just keep an eye on them, throw them on the ground and try to start new populations. That's free. Like that doesn't cost hardly anything. If it doesn't cost anything at all if you don't want it to. And so like there's things they can do that's very simple and doesn't cost a lot of money, and that's what I think we can take on as just individuals that are interested in conservation work. You can do a lot for ecosystems by just driving around and looking on roadsides and, observing what's around you, and you'll eventually start coming across some stuff that could use your help. So
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, we have to, I guess, like reclaim the commons a bit, right? Where it's like, okay,
yeah,
like I technically I'm not responsible for this conservation land, but if I find something particularly valuable or important, I do kind of have a responsibility to do something to make sure it continues.
yeah, that's where I struggled with, man, is like, when I was a private forester, my wife would get on to me. She's like, "You're supposed to be out there like making us money," and I would be managing these populations of stuff for landowners for free. I'd find a rare plant, and they're like, "Well, how can I help it? What do I need to do?" And I'm like, "Well, you could burn it." And they're like, "Well, who can burn it for me?" And I'm like, "Well, I'll burn it for you, and I won't charge you anything." And I just started managing all these places for free because I felt a responsibility to do that. I probably took on more than I should have. But now that, that was another reason that like I wanted to start social media is now like, creating content about this stuff helps me conserve more of those places. And now we manage lots of sites, way more than we used to. And it's all because I started making content about it. So I really like that I'm able to manage places because I'm making content about those places. But you don't have to do that. I did it just by myself for years. And if you have the time to donate, to volunteer your time, I think it's definitely worth doing. And it's very meaningful work. So,
Yeah. And I mean, I think creating the content is the first step in building like an infrastructure to support people education on these subjects of, I mean, there are formal education, but thinking back to when you were in high school, right? Like who is like, I want to burn forests when when I'm older,
yeah.
like no one's like,
Yeah.
you're like, I'm going to be an attorney. I'm going to do this. No one's saying that. And I think,
I went to school with a lot of boys who'd like to set things on fire. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I like to set things on fire, but for different reasons.
yeah, maybe that's just an Alabama thing,
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I do think that like this is kind of like that first step in like, okay, if
Yeah.
I'm not alone, I see this, there's other people, we can like collaborate or like,
Yeah.
do workshops on training people like, hey, you've got this thing in your backyard, like let's talk about it. Or even like more localized, like how do we get people in our neighborhoods to like care about this stuff or to be open, like, oh, we all live on say 2-acre lots, if all our backyards are shared, like why don't we burn like the back 100
Yeah.
feet of all of our yards and turn that into a prairie? Like you need some kind of like, see, this is what it could look like, or this is why it's important. And I think making this kind of content is kind of that first step so that people can even begin those conversations.
Now that you say that out loud, that's exactly what I've done where I live. I've burned for every single one of my neighbors. I've burned their backyards. So it's
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into the Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show.
It's funny. Like I get a lot of messages that say like, "Hey, I wish there was somebody like you around me." And it's funny because I used to think that about the Midwest. Like, man, like the native plant community, like prairie grassland restoration stuff in the Midwest seems so strong. If I was ever looking up anything, like I was looking up information on grasses or whatever, it always came out of like Missouri or Texas with like Lady Bird Johnson or Prairie Moon Nurseries or like it seemed like all there was a huge community and focus in the Midwest, and I was always like, man, I wish there was something like that in the Southeast. But like that's what people need to know is like you can be that person for
Mm.
your community. I used to be in that same position thinking, wow, we need something like that around here because I know nothing about this stuff. And I would love it if there was somebody around here that I can go talk to learn about what should be in North Alabama. You don't have to be educated in it. You can take on that task for yourself and start learning about where you're from. And man, these days iNaturalist is such a good tool
Oh, it's so good.
that everybody can you should use. Like, I'm sure you have if you look around on the projects like where I'm at, there's like I'm in the Molten Valley. There's like a project for like Molten Valley savannas, Molten Valley glades, Molten Valley limestone glades, Molten Valley prairie. Like all these are different projects where you can go in there and see an entire list of species that people are seeing in those places. Like it's so useful. Like, that's what I was looking for whenever I was trying to find what should be here in Alabama where I live. Like I would
Mm.
love to find a book like on the native plants of North Alabama. And now you don't have to have that book. You can go to iNaturalist and it's a complete list there. And it's a community of other people looking at those species that you can reach out to and ask questions to. And it's just iNaturalist is a great tool for doing that, building a local community of conservationists.
Yeah, and to one of the things that's particularly nice about iNaturalist is that it's an evolving thing. So it's not like in your case you found this
Yeah.
new species that if you bought the book a year ago, it wouldn't be in there.
Yeah.
Whereas like with this live community, it kind of has that flexibility to integrate in new things as they become available.
Yeah.
With iNaturalist, like not only do you have that component, but you can also just be like, hey, I want to find this plant, and you can punch it in and see if it's nearby you. And if you want to see what it's like for the first time in real life, you can just go there,
Yeah.
especially if it's on like public lands. Like I was looking for like cucumber root, and it was like, all right, there's one spot within like 10 miles that's been seen. I'm going to go drive there because it's like a public walking trail. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Just don't be stealing stuff.
Yeah.
Don't, that's another thing. People use that to poach. I'm like, yeah, that's please don't use iNaturalist to poach. And if you're posted on iNaturalist and if it's something rare, obscure it so people can't go find it.
Mm.
But it is I do that all the time too. Like when I was up in New Jersey the other day, we pulled up, got to the airport, jumped in the car. I don't know if you know the Pinelands Nursery guys. Do you know any of those folks?
I do not those folks.
Tom with Pinelands Nursery. We got in the truck with him. We're driving, and Jake's like, "Oh, there's some gama grass." And then we got to talking to Tom and his brother, and they're like, "Oh, we've been looking for gama grass for years, like up here in the New Jersey Pine Barrens." And me and Jake saw it we saw it like 3 or 4 times, some huge patches of it. And then I get on iNaturalist and I look, and I'm like, "Well, guys, it's like everywhere. Like I see a lot of. It's not like a ton, but there's spots all around here where people have observed it. Like that's to me, that's like if you've been looking for it for a while, just get on iNaturalist and see if it's even in that area because somebody's probably seen it."
Mm.
But they ended up sending us pictures. They went and they got like 1,000 seeds from all those sites. I think responsibly, of course. I'm sure we're leaving most of those there, but
Mm.
it's such a good tool for seed collecting and finding populations of stuff, especially the more common ones, anyways.
Yeah, I think another piece of this like restoration kind of work is something that we're kind of dancing around. It's this idea of like native nurseries, which like they exist, but not at the scale we need.
Yeah.
So like what are your thoughts about like what that looks like? How do we scale up to what we need and kind of what responsibilities and kind of I guess like bottlenecks do you see around like ecotypes and like how do you think this could actually work so that we can do the restoration that needs to be done?
Like I had a lot of that discussion last week at that Eastern Native Grassland Symposium. I was talking to some seed growers who had contracts with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who was putting a lot of funding towards local ecotype seed growth. Like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is funding people to grow more local ecotype stuff, and they were doing a prairie restoration. I mean, within 50 miles, I think, of this seed grower, and they had a contract with them that was like, I mean, it was like several $100,000 worth of seeds that they were going to use to restore hundreds and hundreds of acres of prairie. Then they got a quote from somebody out in like, I can't remember where it was. It was like way out west, and all of it was like 400 or 500 miles away from this site where they were planting. And they canceled the quote with this seed grower because they got it for a few $1,000s less out west. And they're like, that's so like that's so backwards because you're funding stuff for local ecotype, but then you're not buying the local ecotype stuff. You're going with the cheaper person. And then that cheaper person, guess who they reached out to? That seed grower that they originally were going to go with. Like it's so backwards, man. It's so, if you're going to fund local ecotype stuff, support local ecotype stuff, buy from those local ecotype folks. But then at the same time, also, you can go too extreme, I think, with local ecotype to it's man, this is just conservation is always in that gray area. Like local ecotype is how I would go. It's good. Sometimes it's like at a fault to where if it's not local ecotype, then you just let it turn into invasives or non-native stuff. Like if you have a choice, like if it comes down to it, getting something from a couple states away might be your best option if you don't have anything locally. It's just I don't know. It's just such this. I don't even know how to put it into words. It's like this weird. The words on the tip of my tongue. It's a weird balancing act of
It's like purity testing, but also like if
yeah,
you can't be pure, then it's not worth
yeah,
doing.
yeah, exactly. Like I don't know. I would choose native over non-native, and I would choose non-local ecotype over non-native. But personally, on my own place, I'm going to go as local ecotype as possible because I know I'm able to. So it's like it's so weird, man. It's I don't know. It's sometimes we just take things too serious to a fault, and it's like the same with herbicide. Yeah, it's everything's a tool. Like herbicide can be used for good, it can be used for bad. Chainsaws can be used for good, chainsaws can be used for bad. Fire can be used for good, fire can be used for bad. Like it's not so black and white like people think, and that's why I get like it really infuriates me. Like the Smokey the Bear movement is just like has just villainized fire as like the bad guy. That's something that scares the mess out of me. Like that we're going to do the same thing with herbicide to a point where we're dealing with so many clients now who come to us and are like, yeah, we want this prairie installed, but we don't want to use herbicides. And we're like, then you're not going to be able to install a prairie. Like you're it's solid Johnson grass and Vasey grass and Lespedeza. There it is literally impossible. Like it's going to be impossible to restore this without herbicide. And then it's of course I'm not gonna spray herbicide all over my place just to be spraying it. It's I don't know. It's such a like I don't want to look like I'm pro herbicide because I'm not pro herbicide, but I'm also not anti herbicide. Like I don't know. It's just hard to put into words sometimes, and that's something I experience a lot in this work in this field is people want it so black and white, and it's just not. It just can't be.
Yeah, we definitely have some binary thinking on it, and I think social media can exacerbate that. Where it's
Yeah.
very, and even I'm like I say social media, but that's not even like totally fair. Like from the to go back to where this conversation began, the whole permaculture thing, like a big piece of the anti-herbicide is from Teo Orion's book, War on Invasive
Oh
Species, I think.
no, screw that book. I don't even know what you're. I don't even remember its name.
Yeah.
That's what a stupid book.
Yeah, and like the problem is, to your point, that like she is so close to getting the point, but instead focuses on like these very specific studies of, and like she makes the point of like, we could use these products effectively and responsibly, but we don't,
Yeah,
which to an extent is true.
yeah,
That there are instances of like glyphosate being used like way too willingly, but that doesn't mean that the glyphosate itself is
yeah,
inherently bad, right? It's just we have to be more responsible about it, and
yeah,
contextualizing that in like a greater narrative of like our ecosystems are falling apart, climate change needs more resilient ecosystems. We are all fucked if we don't figure this out.
yeah,
Like, if not us, our kids or our grandkids are screwed. So we do have a responsibility to try to figure it out the best we can. And it's not going to be perfect, but we have to find some common ground that we can move forward on some of these things.
yeah, yeah. It's so dangerous, I think, to spread those kind of like I don't know, and I guess when she's writing that book, she probably didn't. Maybe maybe we'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she didn't think people would take some of that stuff so literally, and because I think I don't know. I could even see that, like people taking like some of the stuff I say, so as the only way to do it, and that's not always the case. But I won't mention any names, but that happens in the native plant world too. Like I bought a book for my daughter. It was for 9 to 12 year olds, and it was about native plants. And I opened the book like midway into the book, and like the first thing I read is after the logging and the fire was removed, the forest started to restore. And it's like it talks about the how fire was destroying these places. And I'm just like, now I'm gonna have to read this book with my daughter to make sure she's not like
You're gonna have to
being
write a
taught
whole
any of
new
this
book
nonsense.
just so she knows the truth.
Yeah, because I've seen personally, I was a forester. I ran 3 or 4 crews of loggers on private properties, and now like I wasn't the same kind of like forester as a lot of the others where they'd come in and take all the good and leave all the bad. Like I was leaving a lot of money on the table because for the sake of doing right by the land, I'd leave a lot of oaks where in not a lot of cases they're going to take every oak they can get. And so but I've seen how logging can totally restore an ecosystem. Like it's still a forest afterwards. There's still a lot of tree cover. You still can't see 600 yards into the distance because there's so many trees, but there's enough canopy open to where you have that forest aspect. You also have the grassland aspect. You also have the woodlands with the shrubs. Like it's the best of all worlds. Like you get like in a longleaf ecosystem, like 99% of the biodiversity is like from the waist down, like it's like on the ground where those longleafs that make up that longleaf ecosystem, yeah, that's what everybody talks about, longleaf pine savannas. But that's such a minor, like that's so little of the biodiversity that's actually in those ecosystems. And when you open up that canopy with logging, which is what has to happen a lot of times because we've removed fire and we've removed disturbance, so there's the trees are at an unnatural density. And so when you help them out and remove that density, those trees are so much healthier. Like let's think of hickories, like and y'all made a podcast about hickories. When you go out looking for hickories, do you have in your mind the most productive hickory you've ever come across? Like,
Yeah.
have you come across like what scenario is that hickory in? Is it competing with a lot of other trees around it?
No, the one I'm thinking of, there's actually a downed tree right next to it that took out like a whole bunch of stuff. So you've got a lot of that canopy opened up.
Yeah, it's like when you reduce the competition, those trees aren't at their prime when they're having to compete with all these other trees for resources. And so, if you want to make a more productive forest or more productive savanna or ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, like removing trees can actually increase the productivity of that ecosystem. And that's something I think people have to see for themselves and just the wildlife rebounding. My friend's place, we did that 4 years ago. We did a timber harvest on it. We ended up cutting a lot of his bigger white oaks, but we left a lot of smaller ones and a lot of hickories. And he's been burning it. And 2 years after that burn, he was trying to turkey hunt out there, and he couldn't even turkey hunt because he was trying to call up a gobbler, but a group of 17 jakes were just harassing him. That's how big of a boom. Like the nesting just exploded. The turkeys just population just exploded because all of a sudden they had all this cover and all this food and all this nesting habitat and brooding habitat that like it was such an explosion of turkeys. Like he couldn't even hunt because there were so many young ones around. But like it's just I don't know. Seeing that for yourself would really change a lot of people's mindset on logging. But and it's the same with fire too. Even more so with fire. It's just such a great tool. And then I know I'm talking a lot. Sorry.
No, that's the whole point.
There, there's a story that just came to mind that I'd like to tell. So back to Madison County, Huntsville, it was all prairie. That was the dominant ecosystem. You go to the public lands there, Wheeler Wildlife Refuge, any of the land trust properties, Montesano, they're all closed canopy forest. Wheeler has some open areas, but it's all planted in crops for the most part. Like there are no prairies left. And so you have a community that was dominated in grasslands. That was the primary ecosystem there. And now today on public lands, no grasslands. The only grassland plants you're going to find are the power lines that go over Montesano where there's no trees. and it's covered in grassland species. That's the only stuff that's left. It's just completely gone. So the city got donated some land. I think it was 300 or 400 acres, near, I think it was the Flint River. And so it had like these little woodland openings everywhere, these fields that might be 5, 6, 10 acre fields, and had several of them out there. And these fields were covered in just fall panicums and all these native warm season grasses, but also native wetland grasses and sedges and rushes. And then you had cardinal flowers and tick seeds and black-eyed Susans and swamp sunflowers and just it was really diverse, like a nice diverse wetland grassland. Well, the city gets a hold of it. So they're like, oh, we want to do something good with this place. So they bring together 11 entities that collaborated together to do a wetland restoration out there. They planted, remember, these are now the only grasslands on public land in Madison County, which was a huge grassland. They planted the whole thing in trees, 10 foot apart, and put up a sign that says wetland restoration. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like, are you kidding me? In 5 years, this is going to be a closed canopy forest, no more grasslands. And what? We need more forest on public land in North Alabama because that's what all of our public land is. Like, why are we trying to make all of our public land one thing, the same type of ecosystem? It's mind blowing to me. And so that just goes to show like who's destroying grasslands, what's destroying grasslands? You've got, development, you've got farming and agriculture, you've got, residential housing, like, and people mowing their yards. And now you've got conservationists, people who are trying to conserve places and they're destroying grasslands in the name of conservation. Like, it blows my mind. Like, that's what they're up against. And it's just, man, it's so frustrating. Like, this is what built Huntsville was the grasslands. Like, there wouldn't have been a huge cotton industry here if it was a forest, because they couldn't have just show up and immediately start farming it. And it wouldn't have had these rich soils that produce higher yields of cotton. They talk about that. And I do a lot of digging in old writings. And even there's this book from the mid 1800s called Early Settlers of Alabama. I think it may have been like 1890 or something. But at that time, they're talking about how the soils have already been decimated. They're complaining about their yields being cut in half because of the soil hasn't been amended and taken care of properly. And that's in the late 1800s. Yeah. Like we're complaining about that now, Yeah. We're complaining about that, back in the 1800s. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
So they were able to farm. It was when, slavery was a thing. With free labor, they were able to farm the poorest ground they could farm and make money because they weren't having to pay anybody to do it. And then when slavery was abolished, they had to change the way they did things. So they went to the higher quality soils. And so all of a sudden these people who were farming very poor ground had to go find the richest ground they could possibly find to farm, because now they're having to pay people, which is a good thing. But not for grasslands, but so they found the richest soils, which is prairie ground, and so they just completely decimated our prairies here in North Alabama for cotton. It's just and I feel like it's time there's a story in the newspaper in Huntsville of an escaped slave his name was Ruffy Woodson. I haven't told this story I've told some of the story on social media, but I haven't really told this idea that I have. But this is something I want to make happen in the next 5 years. This newspaper article was a slave owner trying to find his slave, whose name was Ruffy Woodson, who was a runaway slave. And he said he made it to the Big Prairie in Huntsville, which they called Triana, the Big Prairie. And so Dwayne with Southeastern Grassland Institute, they've been doing some research on that and kind of have found out the boundaries of this historic prairie of North Alabama. And if Dwayne's listening to this, sorry, Dwayne, if you haven't told anybody this yet, but also I've known forever that this is called the Big Prairie. So they said he escaped into the Big Prairie. And so he knew where to run to. As soon as he got in those tall grasses, he disappeared, he was safe. And so that probably also had something to do with why these grasslands were destroyed. This is where slaves were escaping to, were into those tall prairies. And so in the next 5 years, I want to see at least the start of a prairie being restored in Huntsville and Madison County. And I think it should be named the Ruffy Woodson Prairie after after that escaped slave. And I went to Alabama A&M, which is a historical black college, and my sister I grew up with, she's not my real sister, but she lived with us growing up. She's black, and I asked her, I said, "Do you know any Woodsons around North Alabama?" And she was like, "Yeah, which she's related to everybody." She's like, "Yeah, my cousin was a Woodson." So that'll be kind of neat too to see if there's any connection there to our local community to
Yeah.
this guy. And I don't know, I just think that's going to be a really cool thing to try to pursue, to bring back the big prairie of North Alabama, and kind of pay homage to this slave that's was able to escape into it. I don't know if he had family in Nashville. I don't know if he ever actually made it there. I don't know any of the other story, but maybe somebody out there can find something on it. But I'm kind of looking forward to that. I think it's pretty easy to do some good conservation work in an area where there's nothing happening. So maybe that's some encouragement to other folks. If there's absolutely nothing happening in your area, there's some pretty low hanging fruit. You can do very little work and start doing better than what's happening there now. So I don't know. I don't know. That's the kind of stuff I look forward to in the future. So.
Are you looking for a sexy Halloween costume with an ecological twist? Come on down to the Paw Parole's Farming Emporium and Sexy Halloween Warehouse, where we have such favorites as Sexy Upper Middle Class Farmer, Sexy Goat, Teats Optional, Sexy Ivermectin, Sexy Perennial Fruit and Nut Trees, Sexy Swale and Pond Systems, and Blueberry Bush. Find us at our new home on the web, pawparoles.com.
What I really like about that is I think it showcases the way we should be integrating our landscape management into this historical narrative, right? Where our landscapes are histories. They're not just these plots of land that we can stick stuff on. They have their own stories. They have their own significance. And I think a lot of this type of restoration work is honoring some of that. Like, this is what the landscape was once before. We can make it whole again, right?
Yep. It can be brought back. And so we're just north of there. We will be doing that we work with Meta. And I know people have strong opinions about data centers, but they reached out to us wanting to take some marginal areas that were going to be turf grasses and turn them back into prairie. And so we gave them several options. Like we were talking about earlier, where do you want to get seed from? And they chose the option of using local eco type seed. So in the next year or two, we'll be planting a 40-acre prairie in Huntsville, it's going to be not where the big prairie is. It's going to be north of there, but it's still an area that was historically prairie. And it'll be all local eco type stuff we've collected from power lines. And a lot of it's going to come from Morgan County because, like I said, everything in Madison County for the most part is gone. So we will be just restoring a North Alabama prairie back to that area. And then we'll be using that 40-acre prairie as a seed source to restore more in the future. So that'll be kind of cool. And that's like you said, bringing back some of this historical aspect, and that's going to be pretty neat. That's been in the works for a couple of years, and we've got a lot of that seed collected already. So we're excited to get that in the ground in the future. So
yeah, that's awesome. It's funny, we kind of make these unlikely bedfellows when we're pursuing things that we're otherwise incapable of doing. Like just being able to say, I want to do a 40-acre prairie. How else are you going to do that if the government doesn't care about prairies and you don't have a funding source? Like you have to make it work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that might be our best option for, we're losing a lot of ground in North Alabama from these huge developments, but that might be our best way of bringing back some of these places. Cause, I'm on several boards with people from Boeing and Toyota, and both of which are in Huntsville, Meta, Amazon. I don't know. Maybe we can bring all these huge developers together, or these huge companies that developed a lot of land in that area together, and say, "Hey, here's your opportunity to do something really good for this community that you built your business in." And so maybe that'll be a way to make some of that happen, because that land's not going to be cheap, and it's going to take some deep pockets. So, and also working with them, it's kind of, we're setting a new standard for how these places are developed. Right next to my house, I offered my services for free to them. I said, I'll provide seed. do the planning. I'll plan it out. We'll do all the stormwater like this, and they just turn me down. And this week they laid sod down everywhere. It's all going to be turf grass, and then that's why I really like working with Meta, because they are trying to change the way they do things. And I think in any industry, that's what everybody should be striving to do, is to do better than you have in the past. And how can you make these small changes that eventually you're going to get to a point where when you get to a place, you've already had the system set in place. We're done with developing and destroying. We're going to develop this cotton field, and we're going to develop some of it, and then we're going to turn the rest of it back into what it's supposed to be. It's going to be higher quality when we're done than it was when we got here. And I think that's really cool to see kind of a new standard set for how to develop places. And eventually these other folks are going to have to follow, or they're going to look really bad for not doing it. And, SGI has done that with Google in Tennessee, in Clarksville. Google planted a big prairie up there, and they're doing a lot of good stuff there. And so I think Dwayne said that was the most diverse seed mix ever used in a prairie planting, was the one they planted on Google up there.
Oh, wow.
Slowly these folks are maybe setting new standards for it. Maybe it'll trickle into the residential space, like these. Probably not, but that's what my sister does for a living. She works for a new home builder. She's over the biggest new home builder, or the biggest neighborhood in the history of Huntsville. And man, it's just like convincing those guys. They don't want to do anything that's going to take out of their winnings at the end. So
yeah, I've got this theory about new residential subdivisions that the idea should actually be, instead of being like pissed off about like HOAs and like what they do, we should be just focusing on taking them over and rewriting the rules and then mandating.
Yeah. Dude. Oh, we're cut from the same cloth.
Take the tools; they're right there.
Look, do they give the people in their community don't have any say on anything? We should just start an association for homeowners associations.
Yeah.
And be like, look, you have to listen to us,
Or we will take over.
Yeah, or we will take over. Oh, you're fined. We'll just start sending them random fines and complaints.
Yeah, there you go.
And just take them. Yeah, we should do that. We should start a board, and make sure it's all conservation, environmentally focused people on it, and call it the Association of Homeowners Associations, and
I love it.
Just take them over. I've been thinking that for years. Like, we just need to just not give them a choice. Like, sorry, this is now the way you have to do things.
Yeah, I mean,
you don't want to listen to us? You don't want to follow the rules? Wait, well, these are the rules. Like, wait, you don't like being told to do something when it's your own property? You don't like being told to do something on your own property, huh? How ironic,
right?
That'd be great. We should do something like that. But yeah, that's how, I think you're right. That's how it should. We need to just change the whole system, and I've seen that, and I don't know. Maybe it was my cousin. He lives in Huntsville. He's like, yeah, I just got this thing in from my HOA, and they said we can't plant anything now unless it's native. So maybe they are changing. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, I think to the point that you're making with like Google and Meta and even with the homeowners association, I feel like we're moving in the right direction, and it's a matter of hitting critical mass and having the infrastructure ready for when that critical mass hits of, okay, people get this, the tide is shifting. How do we get them to be able to do it when the momentum is there, right? And I think that is my biggest concern around like trying to scale up, is like, all right, well, we need to have resources available, even if it's not nurseries, places that have been identified for seed banks and things like that, where we can maximize our capacity to meet the demands of, restoration, and then restoration within this like greater context of like climate change and like how that is shifting things as well.
Yeah, you worded that way better than I ever could. That you do, man. You do a great job of putting like things that I've thought about into words, and I struggle with that a lot of times. And then when I finally come to it, then I'm like, when I finally figure it out in my head, I've dumbed it down so much to make it make sense to myself. Then I think it makes a good video because I'm just like, the people who have no idea what a native plant is, maybe it's something that they can then consume on social media when I talk about it. Because that's what I always have to just, when I think about these things, I always just have to dumb it down to such Alabama terms that I can understand it. So, but yeah, that man, yesterday, they're talking about these seed banks and these little properties. And I think that's why we focus on that so much. It's like these places, if they're important now, they're going to be even more important in 100 years that they're still around. And there's this little prairie in Athens, Alabama. It was like 14, 15 acres. I think it's the part that got destroyed first is 13 acres, and there was an acre left, so 14. And it had this, it was just it was the most beautiful field of wild white indigo you've ever seen. Huge, like up to your chin high, just hundreds of them out across this field. It looked, I haven't seen anything like that ever. And then at certain times of the year, it'd be rose mallow out there, the huge flowers bigger than your hand, and then swamp milkweeds and gama grass and all these mountain mints and tons of phloxes. And there's a species of Amsonia out there, this blue star that's new, like it hasn't been named yet, and it's the only place it's known to exist in Alabama. Well, they developed 13 acres of it. Before that even happened, I was knocking on those landowners' doors, telling them, "Hey, this is what you have. Like, this is very important. This should be a city park or something. It's right next to the county rodeo or the fairgrounds, like I guess the rodeo grounds. It'd be a perfect spot for like a little natural area." But they put up a sign, "Fill Dirt Wanted," and filled this place in over the past 3 years,
Oh,
to where they made it perk because this is the reason it was never developed or farmed is because it held water, and so they couldn't mow it during the summer or winter. Like there was like it was only during like the driest part of late summer that they could get in there and mow it, and by then all those plants have already done their thing and gone to seed. And so it was still there because of that. Well, what came in and made it perk and like laid all this pipe down to make it drain, and filled it in with fill dirt, asphalt, gravel, concrete chunks, rebar, everything you could think of. They filled it in with, and then there's an acre of it left next door. And so I really tried hard to build that relationship with that landowner. And we had I thought we had a really good relationship, and I offered this fall I was going to burn it. I met him out there a couple months ago when we were looking at it. Told him we were going to burn it. I even showed him all the Amsonias, like the blue star out there that wasn't named yet. Well, last week, right before I left for Pennsylvania, the neighbor across the street, who I've also built a relationship with, she's great. She keeps an eye on the place for me, and I have to park in her driveway to go see it. She sent me pictures, or she texted me. She's like, "Hey, this prairie is being destroyed," and I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess the 13-acre one." And she's like, "No, the other one." And she sent me pictures, and man, he came through, and I guess he didn't want to wait on a burn to clean it up, and he didn't want to bush hog it for some reason. He scraped it, scalped the place, the topsoil, and it's just he piled up all the topsoil into a big pile. And I went out there yesterday and it was just like, man, it's so defeating.
mm.
I just dug up I found right on the property line, I found some of those Amsonias. I don't dig plants. I don't post videos of me digging plants for the most part because I don't want people to think that's something you should go around and do on these like back roads, because I've seen populations destroyed doing that. But in this case, it was going to be destroyed anyway. So I dug up every plant I could find, transplanted them back here to my house. I've got it. It's perfect. It's a perfect spot because I've got a wet like fin in the back of my property. And so planted them all down there. But I called the landowner and I was like, "Hey, like I was, just calling you to check on this place." He's like, "I was planning on burning it this fall for you." And he's like, "Well, it's a little late for that now." And I was like, "Well, I mean, I would have burned it sooner, but we're under a burn ban at the moment. It doesn't lift until the end of October." And he's like, "Well, I just was tired of looking at it." And so I was like, "Well, what can I buy this place from you?" Like, he was like, I don't really want to sell it." And I was like, "What if I pay you more than it's worth?" "Well, yeah, I'd probably sell it. I would probably sell it then." And so it's 1 acre, and if I'm hoping this stuff comes back up, but I think we're going to try to do our T-shirt campaign we did with the leafy prairie clover to try to raise some funds to buy this 1 acre, because it is like the last place a lot of this stuff is found, and if it comes back, which I'm hoping it does, it's going to be a very important remnant for future generations to be able to seed collect from. And I was literally, I'm not even joking, this is my life. 5 minutes before that lady sent me the text about it being destroyed, I had just emailed Southeastern Grassland Institute, and they were asking for properties to come do research plots on. And so I listed off 3 properties that I thought they would like to research the most, and I mentioned that one to them. And then 5 minutes after I sent that email, I get a picture of it being destroyed. I'm like, dude, this is like, is this a joke? Like, it's just crazy. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. I forget. But anyways, that's what happened yesterday. But
yeah, I think like this points to 2 things, right? It's one is like building these relationships, which is really difficult in an economic system that like values the land for developmental value over the ecological value, right? And then 2 is like how can we expect to restore and save these landscapes without a financial stream, right? Like, how do we build an infrastructure that can financially support this type of work?
Yeah.
As an account, like my day job is an accountant, so like I've racked my head about this, like what different ways we could make this work, and it's difficult.
We did it with the leafy prairie clover shirt, and that was just an idea I've had forever. Like, hey, what if we had some artwork made of a species, sold it on a T-shirt or however, and was able to, through selling merch of it, like we're raising awareness for that species, but also by raising awareness is also funding the conservation of it. And so that was kind of cool to see that work for us last year. And I'm hoping to like maybe we can keep repeating that. Like I hate selling stuff, like the consumerism aspect to it. I hate, but like people want to help out, and people also want to. I mean, I think people like being able to advocate for some of that stuff. So that's if somebody's going to buy a shirt, I guess it's better to be one with a native plant, a rare plant on it or something. But another thing I was going to say, that 13 acres next door over there doing the field dirt, there's a couple guys out there yesterday putting in more silt fencing. And so I walked up to talk to them. I was like, hey, do y'all know one of y'all the landowner or know the landowner? And one of the guys was like, oh, dude, I follow you on TikTok. I can't believe you're here in person. Like, oh my gosh. Like, he just kept going on and on. I'm like, hey, yeah, like good to meet you and everything. And I was like, I've been keeping an eye on this place for like 5 years and telling him all about it. And I was like, do you have a number for the landowner so I can reach out to him? He's like, no, but he said, I'll give you my number and I'll try to find a contact. And as I was pulling out, I saw this huge fill dirt wanted sign, they put by the road trying to get people to come dump fill dirt there. I was like, well, that's probably the landowner. I'll call him, and I put the number in, and it was that guy's number. So that guy who was like filling in this prairie was also a guy who watches me on TikTok. I'm like, what the heck, man? Like, I didn't really like. How do you follow me? You're also on the side that's destroying one of our prairie remnants. Like, but that was kind of interesting. But
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm hoping we can buy that little 1 acre or save it, man. That's those kind of places. It's literally the last of its kind. There's nothing like it around there. Most people would, if I didn't find it, it would have just been destroyed and we'd never even known. Like that's the thing is you don't get out there and look for these places. They're actively being destroyed like every day. And if we don't find them, if we don't like start acting quickly to find and save some of these places, they will just totally disappear. And, they won't even be known for the history books. Like it's like they never even existed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it really raises an interesting question though about like our responsibility versus the legality of protecting these types of landscapes, which is given that this is a public recording, you don't have to say anything more than that. But there's a very ethical, I think, especially as responsible as we might feel about what is my responsibility to the earth versus my legal capacity to do things.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not going to say there's any right answer to that, but I think there's no way you can look at the way the landscape is being treated and not have that bubble up in your gut a little bit.
Yeah, it is sickening. Like, I don't know. It's got to be like people. I get that message a lot. Like, hey, how do you deal with all this? I'm just like, unfortunately, I've gone through like way worse things in life. Like, so this is like nothing compared to the things I've gone through. So it's like not that big of a deal. But like I find a way to cope with it. But it's like I think it is like you get wins every now and then, and being able to save some of these species and create other populations of them like that, those are the kind of things that as long as I'm continuing to do that, and then also educating about these places, it's kind of a balancing act, I guess. Like, it just keeps me sane, I guess, because it is a lot of loss. Like this one next door to me where I grew up, this development, federally endangered Tennessee yellow-eyed grass out there. I just got pictures of it. I knew it was out there, but I couldn't trespass. But I scoured the property lines using binoculars. I finally found it like 2 or 3 days ago, and I emailed the senator. One of our senators is on the board. He's the chairman of the board for this developer. He's also vice president of Cooks, which is a nature museum in Decatur. So he is a part of educating. And this, like, every school in North Alabama goes on field trips to this place to learn about Alabama's biodiversity. He's also chairman of the board that's destroying the last of this ecosystem. Our only population of round-headed Lespedeza in Morgan County or any surrounding county, the only known population in our county of this false foxglove, the largest population of that Rudbeckia palustris. There's a population of the federally endangered Tennessee yellow-eyed grass there. I mean, it's like, and those are just the ones that like have some like a rarity to, like, it was very, very intact. Just 35 acres of it. Just, how is that even possible? They're about to reroute the whole entire stream that goes through it. I'm just like, how do you sleep at night when you're part of the educating of biodiversity in Alabama, but you're also part of the destruction of very unique places in Alabama? Like, this place isn't a cotton field that's lost all its biodiversity. The biodiversity is still there, and now it's turf grass. It's just, man, it drives me nuts. But I sent him an email a couple of days ago inviting him out to tour one of these prairies with me. So no response yet, but we'll see.
Yeah. It's difficult to deal with any of this in many ways, because it does feel like you're just like slamming your head against a wall, and then coming to terms with that reality is just really difficult. But if you do that shirt project to raise some funds, let me know. I'm happy to make sure people are aware of it. I want to get it out there for folks, try to leverage whatever we can for you guys, because I would like to see that get saved.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. My next one was going to be, I like to focus on the federally endangered stuff, because when you find a federally endangered plant, there's usually a lot of other rare stuff there. But my next one was going to be Leavenworthia crasso, this glade cress that's only found in Morgan County and Lawrence County, Alabama, and nowhere else. But there's a property that has a ton of it and a ton of other great stuff that I was going to try to save. But this one seems to be more pressing at the moment, so this is probably going to be the next one we do. Is that, and I don't know what it's going to look like, but we're working with Science Visuals on that. We're trying to make it to where it has flowers on it, but a guy also would want to wear it. So that's sometimes difficult.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Before I wrap up, I do want to plug my buddy Slim, runs Nickajack Almanac in Georgia, but he does a lot of prescribed burns and things like that. So it's for folks that might be tuning in that don't normally listen to us and care about the work you're doing. He also does some pretty similar work. So I definitely want folks that are looking for, ultimately, and I think I've seen you post about this too, my hope is that there are dozens of accounts doing similar stuff, but focusing on the regions that they know. Because to your point, when you were in New Jersey, you can't know everything about everywhere, but all these places deserve to be represented.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for folks that are in those areas that do feel comfortable on social media to try to find their way to do that. And I'm always happy to try to platform that.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more folks talking about these places, and even if you're not on social media, just start reaching out to others in your community and just bring together the forces and try to protect some of these places. There's people out there that want to help. And before we go too, I wanted to mention you made me look really good a couple of months ago.
Did I?
I was at I was at a wild turkey dinner, and they had a Q&A with like all these turkey biologists. There's like Dudley from Mossy Oak Native Nurseries was there, and like there's a bunch of just people way smarter than me on the panel. And this one guy was up talking. He was like, I've got cows on my place, and I'm wanting to do this like silviculture thing. I'm going to plant a bunch of nut bushes, and just kept talking about these nut bushes. And like, you could tell like everybody else is like, what the heck's he talking about? And so they were like, oh, Kyle, you want to answer this one? And I was like, sure. And so I was like, by nut bushes, I assumed you're talking about hazelnut. And he's like, yeah, yeah. I was like, is it like a hybrid? And he's like, yeah, it's a I'm going to plant hybrids. And so we were talking about cattle and hazelnuts. And man, just listen to y'all's podcast on hazelnuts like that week. And so I looked like an absolute genius. Everybody afterwards was like, dude, how the heck did you know he was talking about hazelnuts when he said nut bushes? Like, I've never even heard of anybody planting hazel bushes in the South. Like, I was like, I listened to this podcast like last week on hazelnuts.
That's awesome.
So that really helped. It really made me look like very knowledgeable at this Q&A panel to the whole public. You know, there's a huge crowd, and I look like a genius because I do about hazelnuts.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny how stuff times like that. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a blast, and I'm looking forward to seeing all the new content you keep putting out.
Yeah, same to y'all, man. Appreciate what y'all are doing and the great podcast. So, I send them, I'll send them to friends of mine all the time, and man, I love y'all's deep dives on different species. It's I learn a lot from them. So
awesome.
As somebody who was mainly self-educated after college, it's a great resource, and I get a lot out of it. So I'm sure everybody else does as well. But thank y'all for doing what y'all do.
Awesome. Thank you.